Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and today I'm very happy to welcome to this radio program renowned author and journalist Michael Lewis. Michael Lewis is the author of many best-selling books, including The Big Short, Moneyball, and Liars Poker. His latest book is now out in paperback. It's called The Premonition, a Pandemic Story. He regularly publishes for Vanity Fair, the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, and others. He's also host of the podcast, which is called Against the Rules. It's a podcast that looks at what happens to fairness in American life through the lens of people who depend on public trust. The third season of Against the Rules, out again this week, tackles what happens to our trust in experts and expertise, the people that we rely on. Michael Lewis, it is a great pleasure, sir, to welcome you to this radio program. Thank you for taking this time.
Good to meet you, Mitch.
The people you feature in your podcast seem to be the same kind of people you use, the same kind of characters in a loose way that you use in the books that you write. Do you see your podcast as an extension of what you do with your books?
Well, that's a funny question because it really has, I think people have such a vague idea of the podcasting landscape now, I think, unless they're in it. And the probably most common podcast is just what you and I are doing right now. Two people just talking. And that's not what this is. I mean, these are kind of scripted episodes. And I mean, I spend a lot of time writing them. I interview a whole bunch of people and then I sit down with the tape and I actually write it quite a bit. So it is very in the degree of effort that goes into it. It's very like my magazine life. And I think in a funny way, what it has done is stepped in and replaced some of my magazine life. And what I used to use the magazine life for is R&D for the books, a way to wander around the world without too much commitment to what I was doing. And in the writing of the magazine pieces, I would figure out what the books were. And I think the podcast is partly replaced that. But I do see it as like very much a part of my writing life. Flexes different muscles, sort of like, I don't know, literary cross-training, than actually sitting down and writing long form prose. But it takes me into subject matter that might naturally be literary subject matter. And yes, the characters, in some cases, the characters are the same as the books. I mean, this season is about experts. And one of the episodes I went back to Moneyball for, because I got so interested and have been so interested in what happened to expertise in baseball. And the main character of the show is Bill James, who is sort of the forefather of the whole Moneyball movement.
That's interesting. Back to Moneyball was this best-selling book that you wrote and published in 2003 about how statistics have changed the game of baseball. Baseball's always been a game of statistics, but a new era of statistics or a new kind of statistics started to be introduced. And of course, many people will recognize the movie, the major motion film that was made on that book.
And what happened apropos of expertise and apropos of Against the Rules, the podcast, is who was the expert in baseball changed. I mean, yes, baseball always had statistics, but they've been used pretty loosely. The wrong statistics were paid attention to. Some of the wrong things were measured, or the right things weren't measured on a baseball field. People didn't take the predictive ability of the statistics as seriously as maybe they should have. It was just a much less sophisticated analysis of what the players were doing, and a maybe overconfidence on the part of professional baseball people that they could just look at a baseball player and know who was good and who was doing what. And this statistical movement, it's basically a data movement, right? That happens inside baseball and inside of professional sports, and then sweeps through the society. That movement really changed in sports, but baseball especially, who the expert was, who's running these teams, who's deciding how you put together teams and who you trade for and who you get rid of and all that. And it's changed from the person who spent their careers playing baseball, marinating in the game, former minor leaguer types, to people who have real facility with statistics, and often people who didn't play, at all. So that kind of thing has happened in a lot of walks of American life. where the data people have moved in and without personal experience of the thing that they are expert in, have sort of come in on top and taken over the running of things. And baseball is a really dramatic example. And what I was curious about in the podcast was going back to talk to Bill James, who is sort of the person who starts all this, not because he's particularly interested in numbers, because he's obsessed with baseball and he's comfortable with numbers and he's got a really clean, logical mind. To go back and talk to him about why this happened in the first place in the 70s, like what was going through his head when he was a little kid and he starts doing this, and what he made of the movement he spawned.
Yeah, it was a newsletter, right? He started it all by just a newsletter. A guy
really
on the outside.
It's a great story. I mean, he's in Lawrence, Kansas. He's effectively orphaned when he's very young, and he's looking for. It's just him and his big sister, kind of, who's a couple of years older, and they're both looking for ways to control what is a chaotic world. They've lost their mother. Their father's badly injured. The sister turns to religion. He turns to baseball, and he gets obsessed with the players and their numbers from the time he's a little kid, and he starts listening to what the announcers say, and he wants to believe the announcers. What he's attracted to is that it's such an orderly world. It's a world in which you can seem to have complete understanding. And he over some years learns that actually even this very orderly little world on a baseball diamond is not as well understood as people think. And he starts to have his own thoughts. And he graduates from college. He goes to work as a night watchman in the Stokely Van Camp's pork and bean factory there in Kansas. So he has time to continue to pore over baseball statistics and think his thoughts about baseball. And the first thing he does is publish he thinks of it as a book, but it's, stapled together and mailed to anybody who sends him a check for it. It's a self-published book that opens with 40 pages of baseball numbers. It's hard to imagine why anybody would want to even read this thing. But when you finally get into it, he's thinking thoughts about the game that other people just aren't thinking. It's like wholly original intellectual life. And so it is the beginning of change of who is the expert in this field, which will have this knock-on effect in lots of other fields. But so the podcast about him is like partly about how it starts, but it's also partly about his disillusion with what happened since. Like it's not that he disapproved of my book. I think he basically approved of my book. I don't actually know that though. He never said he disapproved, but he certainly has misgivings about the numbers that are now all over the game, crawling all over the television screen, the statistics that are thrown out constantly by the announcers. And his problem is that he says that the people who the new experts who sort of replace the old experts because what they're doing is more complicated and it's quantitative and involves sophisticated statistical analysis, that they are partly in the business of, like the old experts, persuading people they know more than they do. And what he was always attracted to was wonder and questioning and trying to find out something new, and starting from a point of modesty, of a humility, like recognizing how little we know. And it bothers him, this feeling of, there's almost a self-satisfied feeling he detects, that this illusion of certainty, that we now know everything there is to know, where he has a picture on the wall of his office of a baseball diamond. He described it to me back then and describes it to me now. He says, that's not a baseball field. That's a field of ignorance, that we still don't know so much about what goes on there. And this pretense that just because it's all gotten so much more complicated, we understand everything is false. Maybe we understand more, but the spirit in which he operated, he feels is not so present anymore in the running of the game. And I thought that was interesting. So it gave me a chance to revisit. You said, sometimes I'm I'm finding characters who are quite like the kind of characters I might write about in a book. But in this case, it was a character I actually wrote about in the book, and I went back and sort of re-excavated him and found things that I hadn't found the first time around.
Michael Lewis, over the years, you've written a good number of books about the financial world. In the 80s, you worked on Wall Street yourself. Your first book is Liars Poker, which is about that experience and about Wall Street. Do you see a parallel to what has happened and what happens in the financial world to baseball in the story about Bill James?
Well, that's interesting. There are some parallels. I mean, apropos what we were just talking about, that what happened in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, it's about the same time it was happening in Bill James's mind. The technology enabled a lot of complexity in the financial system. And by the time I'm there, complexity really is the new form of opacity. Complexity is how people on the inside prevent people from the outside from understanding what's going on the inside. I mean, in the financial crisis, it was a direct result of that. People just did. I mean, even people who ran the firms didn't know what was going on inside their own firms because it got so complicated. And when I come and write The Big Short about it, disentangling what happened was just absurdly complicated. So that's the intellectualization of finance runs parallel to the intellectualization of sports, of baseball. And some of it's to the good. Some of it leads to greater wealth for the society and more efficiency, but some of it is not. Some of it just enables a lot of bad behavior because people can't actually see the behavior anymore because it's opaque. So that's one connection. And a byproduct of this is the kind of person who's doing the job. So running baseball teams, and I mean, they're franchises, like from the minor leagues on up, these professional baseball organizations, was for most of the history of baseball, kind of a blue collar job. I mean, you didn't need a college degree to get into baseball, and you didn't need a college degree to become a baseball expert or even run a baseball team. And that was also true on Wall Street trading floors, that before it was intellectualized, the kind of people who were making very good livings in trading jobs often were, Vinny and Danny and Donnie from Staten Island, who maybe got out of high school, but not beyond, and they just had elbow grease and street smarts, and they didn't have to have the fancy education. So, you see expressed in both places is a change as a result of the intellectualization of the thing, is a change in the kind of person who's doing the thing, and a squeezing out of another kind of person. So, whereas before both those environments would have been places for economic mobility, they're now really not. You pass through the same filters for those jobs that you do for a lot of other jobs at the top of the society, and that's a loss. I mean, I'm all for mixing it up a lot more. It's a shame you got to go to Harvard for everything now.
When I think of major societal changes or shifts, it's usually, though maybe not always, but usually accompanied by some change in technology. Do you just think our reliance on computers and then the internet and just our technological world plays a large part in this? I mean, the Wall Street you worked on, you were still using phones, right? That were connected to the walls or the beams or something.
It's funny that you're taking me back to the beginning of my career here, but I just went back to the beginning of my career because I just recorded for the first time a full-length version of Liar's Poker, my first book, as an audiobook. It had never been done, and we were trying to, with the podcast company Pushkin that I do my podcast with, we were trying to see if we could do a different kind of audiobook. And in doing it, I did a couple of other things. First, I was brought back, taken on a stroll down memory lane. But second, we did we did 5 episodes of a podcast on the side of the book, kind of like asking questions like what had changed. And I got on the phone, a bunch of people who were actually in the book, and they all kind of say the same thing about what's changed, and the big thing is kind of a dehumanization of finance, that people used to shout, not just talk on the phone, they'd shout at each other. You could get a feel just by walking onto a trading floor, what was going on in the markets, just by the temperature in the room. You walk into a big hedge fund or a Wall Street trading floor now, and it's completely silent. It's just people staring at their screens and tapping on their keyboards, and you don't get much of a feel of anything. Many markets are just fully automated. I mean, it's actually algorithms that are making the trading decisions. So if nothing else, it's clearly less good literary material, because people aren't really interacting in the way that they used to interact. And you don't have the same warm, hot feeling that you had on the middle of an old Wall Street trading floor. That's a very big change. And I think there are old baseball people would have the same complaint about new baseball people, that it's all become divorced from the actual people, that you're making these decisions based on analysis of performance statistics, and you're not paying enough attention to the people. I'd argue about that a little bit with the old baseball people, because old baseball people, I'm not sure how much they paid attention to the actual people either. But there is this sense that, it was an odd thing that if you think about when you're evaluating a young baseball player, is he going to become a good professional baseball player? You really do want to know things like, how's he going to feel when he's away from his mama? Or what happens if you give him a whole bunch of money? Or does he like to drink? Or all that kind of stuff. And the old baseball people didn't do that any more than find out the answer to those questions any more than the new baseball people do. But it does, on the surface anyway, feel slightly less human, more dehumanized, because of the change.
Sticking with Bill James here, and this is just off the top of my head. If I realized we were going to go so deep into baseball, I would have dug into it more before we began. But,
Me too.
But I do find this.
I thought we were talking about the Premonition and whatever. But
we are.
It's fine.
And we are. But I did want to follow up with that, because to use it more as a metaphor than actually talking about baseball, but and also the financial world and Wall Street. I guess there's a critique out there about what has happened to statistics and baseball, in that suddenly, and I guess the idea is to get the most out of a player as efficiently as you can. In other words, if you think about the team you wrote about in 2003, the Oakland A's, a very good baseball team with one of the lowest salaries of all the game. And the idea was to get as much out of someone by paying them as little as possible. Now, that might sound harsh the way I'm describing it there. But I mean, if we think about what has happened in baseball and how numbers play a role and how people are looked at, I can't help but also think about what we see in Amazon factory, houses, storehouses across the country, and how people are managed.
It's a little different. If you're going to find the baseball analogy to the Amazon worker, it's the minor leaguer. At the big league level, there's a market for these people, and I would say the Oakland A's were paying the players they had more than the other teams would pay them. The Oakland A's wanted them more. What was going on was they were finding value in people who other people didn't see value in. So the players themselves would have been quite grateful for that. Oh, this team sees something in me that other teams don't.
And they still get paid well. I mean,
No. I know, but
yeah.
But the idea that you're kind of trying to milk value of major league players out of them unfairly, that doesn't ring true. However, the whole farm system, that seems egregious. That and very young players who don't have bargaining rights. That they're drafted, and the team that drafts them owns whatever it is now, the first 6 years of the service in the big leagues, and they aren't paid a market rate. This all has to do with how the players union negotiates with the owners and the skew of interest in the players union towards old veterans. No one's watching out for the minor leaguers or the people who are going to be drafted 5 years from now. So that it is, I find it outrageous that there's even such a thing as a draft where the players can't auction themselves to the highest bidder. Everybody, it's that the constraint on wages coming in seems to me very unfair. And so you've had this very odd system for a while where players, they don't get paid in the beginning of their career, they get paid at the end of their career, and they're often getting paid a lot more for less productive years than they got paid for their more productive years. It's a screwy system. That's screwy in a slightly different way from the Amazon warehouse. It's really absence of bargaining power. And where you find the absence of bargaining power is in baseball and professional sports is with the people who are not at the table, the minor leaguers and the kids who are going to be players in the future. So it's funny. I didn't think of it as exploitative when I was writing Moneyball. I thought of it as just the opposite. It's almost inspiring that you had all these people who on a team who other teams hadn't seen the full value of, or in some cases any real value in. And through a better analysis of their performance, this team comes along and builds a juggernaut out of these spare parts. And what it said to me was, like, where else does this happen? If a baseball player can be misvalued because people aren't seeing how good he actually is because of how he looks or because of some stereotype they have in their head about what a good baseball player is, who can't be misvalued. And the A's were showing us that, like, a lot of people have value locked in them that the society's not seeing.
This is Letters and Politics, and today we are in conversation with renowned author and writer Michael Lewis. Michael Lewis is the author of such books as The Big Short, Moneyball, and Liars Poker. His latest book, which is out in paperback this week, is called The Premonition, A Pandemic Story. Also out this week is the third season of his podcast called Against the Rules. This third season is going to be looking at experts and what has happened to our trust in experts. Okay, I will build a bridge now to the premonition and talking about the
talk
pandemic.
About whatever you want to talk about.
And well, I do want to, though, because again, these are just things that I thought about, and I could be way off here. But when I was looking at your body of work, when preparing for this conversation, it made me think a lot about what has happened to society really since the 1970s, with the rise of financialization and also an attack, I guess. I'll say an attack on government, an attack on New Deal programs, and really what has happened in the last 50 years. And I felt like I was seeing that in your body of work compared from your books about the financial world, which there are a number of them. But then when we get to the premonition, which is about the response to the pandemic that's going on, or even a previous book called The Fifth Risk, which was about the transition period out of the Obama administration into the Trump administration. Do you see a parallel there with your body of work of what has happened to American life in the last 50 years?
Yes. Yes. So then the last two books are very much about the consequences of our bizarre relationship to our federal government. I mean, there really isn't another democracy in which large chunks of the population regard their own government as the enemy. It's a bizarre situation. It was a useful political rhetorical device for Ronald Reagan. It's just spun out of control. And it came to my mind to its kind of natural conclusion in Donald Trump. And that's how I got interested was really simple. When he was elected, he had fired the day after the election, the 500 and something person team of people who were meant to go in and have the government explained to them by the outgoing Obama administration. So the Obama administration had spent, I don't know, 6 months and 1,000 people's time essentially preparing the best college course ever created on the federal government. Bush had done the same thing for Obama. It's required by law. Obama was really grateful. It made the transition of power very smooth. And it meant that the people coming into the jobs of running the federal agencies, knew what was going on in those agencies and how problems had been dealt with and what the problems were before they took office. And most of these things aren't ideological. And that's what gets lost, is that there are a lot of ways to look at the federal government. But one is this very elaborate risk management tool that's there to keep us all safe, first and foremost, run by and staffed by experts. And there are more existential risks out there than you want to think about. But it's the risk of financial crisis. It's the risk of it's food safety. It's risk of nuclear weapons going off when they shouldn't go off. It's risks of natural disasters. It's one thing after another. And there are passionate, mission-driven, exquisitely educated and trained people who could make a lot more money doing something in the private sector, who staff these risk management functions. And you really need to understand what they do if you're going to manage them. So the Trump had decided right out from the get-go, he didn't need to know. He knew, in fact, I think he even said, I'm the expert. And he made a joke of his kind of the appointments of people to his various cabinet positions. And I thought, well, what's the consequence of this? And fifth risk was an attempt to wander around parts of the federal government that we don't think about very much: Commerce Department, the Agriculture Department, the Energy Department, places people aren't looking, and say, all right, what's in here, and what does it mean to neglect this? And my takeaway was, all right, there's this vast portfolio of risks. You never know what bad thing's going to happen. If we neglect the risk management tools, something's going to happen, and we're going to be screwed. What's that thing going to be? And I think Trump got incredibly lucky for the first few years of his administration that nothing really bad happened that required him to be a risk manager. And then the pandemic occurs. So the pandemic occurs, and I was primed because I'd written the fifth risk. Like, all right, this is the thing. What happens? And very quickly, you see, months into it, a statistic floats to the surface and is unignorable and remains stable until we get a vaccine. And the United States has a bit more than 4% of the population of the world, and we have a bit more than 20% of the deaths. This, in spite of the fact that we were judged by experts to be best prepared in the whole world for any pandemic, that we should kind of outperform the world in our response to any pandemic. So it felt to me like, oh, this is like the University of Texas football team. Every year they're ranked higher in the polls than they end up. So there's something fundamentally wrong with the management of Texas football. What was fundamentally wrong with our management? And of course, it was at the federal level that it broke down, the Centers for Disease Control. So I started thinking about, how do you tell this story? And I wasn't very much interested in the pandemic itself. It was really what happened that laid the groundwork for this failed response. So the Premonition is very similar to The Big Short. It's a story about a broken system told through several characters who were intimately involved with that system in the run-up to the system's brokenness being exposed to all. And it's easily the most fun book I've ever written. It's funny. It's a pandemic. You think of it as a grim subject. Easily the most fun I've had writing a book, the most kind of exhilarating experience, because the characters were so unbelievable. But in the characters, a local public health official, the people who actually wrote the pandemic response plan for the United States, and a cutting edge, state of the art UCSF virus hunter all these characters they knew running into it that if anything bad happened, the system was not really equipped to deal with it. And we had big structural problems in our and it was kind of getting that across. It's like in these people's experience, you start to glimpse what our problems are in responding to this kind of threat. And the surprise to me was that as bad as Trump was, and he was horrible, and he has blood on his hands. If your mind comes to rest at the idea that the reason we responded so badly to the pandemic was Donald Trump was president, you're missing the point. It runs more deeply than that. It runs to, as you say, right back to the 70s. And this kind of systematic attack on federal institutions that undermine their ability to do their jobs, and a restructuring of them in some ways. It creates incentives for them to almost avoid doing their job, certainly avoid political risk. So that the story kind of took me places where this was why stories are so much fun, where I wasn't quite expecting to go, and it was sobering, because if the problem isn't just Donald Trump, just getting rid of Donald Trump doesn't fix it. There has to be a broader national conversation. And amazing to me, 2 years into it, and after a million Americans have died, we're really not having the conversation yet. We'll have to, but we're not having it yet.
I almost think there's pandemic fatigue now, even though we're not necessarily out of it.
I've had the most interesting experience with the publication of this book. There have been a couple of other times I've had the response to a book where, oh, that's odd. I didn't expect that when the book landed. I wrote a book called The Blind Side. And I thought, I loved the story so much. I thought it's going to have its way in the world. Not realizing that it was partly a football book, that people who really love football really don't read books. And that, like, it just didn't reach them. It just you couldn't get to them. You could throw books inside of stadiums filled with football fans, and they just walk around the book. We just didn't. So that this inability to kind of connect with this book, I was surprised again, because I wasn't prepared for just how, even though obviously our society is polarized and tribalized, and there's the right and the left, and they don't talk to each other, and you have to identify very quickly with one or the other, or you're in trouble. And this was a story that was more complicated than just right or left. The right bore more responsibility, a lot more responsibility, for what has gone on at the federal level than the left. But it wasn't really about right and left. It wasn't exactly neatly assigning blame or credit by political identity. And the characters themselves were all over the map. They were doctors, really. They were not political people. All the main characters are basically doctors. I wasn't prepared for the initial response to the book to be filtered through the tribes, and for one tribe to be upset that I didn't just tell the story of how Donald Trump screwed up the pandemic, which is part of the story, but it was only part of the story. And the other side upset because the story clearly reflected badly on Donald Trump, even if it didn't reflect as badly as it should have or could have. And the conversation kind of stopping there, like what it meant for each tribe. And it's got to readers now, but it's got to readers in a completely different way. And the way it's really going to get to readers is the same way The Blind Side did. There's a movie that's in the works, and people will say, oh, this is a story. These are characters. This is fun. And they'll go read it. But after they've seen the movie, it didn't trigger what I thought it was going to trigger, which was what The Big Short triggered. Because The Big Short, when it came out, it didn't have the same kind of there wasn't a tribal war going on about the financial crisis. Everybody's kind of agreed upon. Everybody's just hating Wall Street. That I thought The Big Short triggered this kind of conversation in Washington about, like, what do you do? And senators talking about the book, I was asked to testify every other week. I kind of thought the same thing was going to happen with this. Not that I would ever be the expert, but I thought that my characters, everybody would say, turn to them and say, "Oh my God, these are the people who know." And we want to hear what they have to say. It's happened a bit, but not nearly the way I thought it was going to happen.
During the George W. Bush presidency, I was a congressional correspondent, and I covered a lot of congressional hearings. And every now and then, and I don't want to act like I did all the time, but every now and then I would cover a hearing about some warning that didn't seem imminent, that didn't seem was going to happen tomorrow or next week, but down the line. It was not well attended, these hearings. Frequently, I would be the only reporter there covering these hearings. And so I was thinking about this when you're talking about, and I've told people this, whether if it was Trump, and as you say, Trump certainly had his problems with handling the pandemic, but even if it was the Obama administration or whatever administration really of recent times, this would have been a mess regardless.
Yes, it would have been a mess regardless, and it would have been less of a mess, but it would have been a mess regardless. And you can see it. I find what got me going in the beginning on this book was these two doctors in the Bush who'd been brought into the Bush administration to answer the question, what to do in the beginning of a pandemic. I mean, they were there to write part of a pandemic plan, but they got assigned the bit that it was the most controversial, which was what happens between the time the pathogen starts spreading and the time you have a vaccine. How do you minimize disease and death at taking into account the economic costs of whatever you're doing? And it was an original intellectual exercise that they engaged in. They all the social distancing, the closing of schools, all of this goes back to their work, although they would argue that it was done differently than they imagined it would be done. But they find something without realizing they found it really interesting in the process of doing what they do. They make an original case for social interventions, for non-pharmaceutical interventions that you need to space people, basically. And here are the best ways to do it, and here's why. And they go back to 1918. They relitigate 1918. And they show cities that actually did this kind of thing, closing saloons and churches and so on, suffered a fraction of the death rates of the cities that didn't, in relation to when the virus appeared in the city. So this stuff works. But when they go out to sell the idea, their plan, to the public health community, who you would think would be the most receptive part of America, everybody says this won't work and the costs will be too high. Until they start talking about children dying. And the disease they had in mind was an influenza pandemic that was going to attack children, maybe worse than it attacked adults. And the minute they start talking about children dying, everybody flips. But it took the emotional punch of witnessing children dying to get people to take these pretty limited actions that would save the lives of American citizens. What that told you in a funny way was that if we had a virus that came through the society, highly transmissible, deadly, but didn't kill children, you might get the wrong response to this stuff. They uncover all this way back when, and we didn't think through the particular virus that we had. Why would we? Who knew what was coming? But they could have told you it was going to be complicated. And to your point about sitting through congressional hearings with people coming to talk about risks that you think, well, that's remote. A meteor is not going to strike the world, and that kind of thing. There are hundreds of these, and they're all remote. Why we have the federal government is to have people paying attention to this and know what to do on the very remote chance that one of these things actually happens. And what was striking to me, actually, which led to the podcast, was how we didn't access those people in an efficient way when the thing happened. That the characters in my book really should have been the people running the pandemic response. They were very close to being in that position, but they weren't. And people have forgotten about them. They were the world's authorities on how to communicate, how to strategize, how to think about what you do before you get a vaccine to minimize death, and explaining it to the American people. And instead, they were on an email chain all by themselves, with some people paying attention to them, but they weren't leading it. And it's a shame that we create this expertise and then don't use it properly. That we don't access it when we need it. It's an inefficiency in the society.
Where does that failure come from? Where does that disconnect happen?
Party politics, the combination of tribalization. So if this expertise happens to have arisen in the Bush White House, it's less likely to be accessed by Trump because he thinks anybody associated with Bush is his enemy, or even by Democrats. It's partly that, and partly the politicization of the civil service. That if you go back 50 years, the people at the top of the CDC were career civil servants. The president couldn't just pick up a phone and fire them without cause. They had some distance from the process. They could stay across administrations. We have steadily decreased the number of permanent civil servants in these critical functions and made them presidential appointees, which puts them on a much shorter leash, leaves them in their jobs for a much shorter period of time, makes them much more sensitive to the momentary demands of the White House. I mean, there's a lot else going on, but that's a big thing. And what happens is you lose institutional memory when you make the leadership of the various departments of the federal government so transitory. So I think that's a big thing that's going on. And if you gave me a magic wand to wave over Washington, I'd make a lot of the jobs that the president now appoints career civil servants. And I would also engage in a big communication outreach to the American people, explaining what these jobs are, why the people in them are the world's experts at what they do, and why we need them to be there for careers rather than a couple of years.
It seems to me with the pandemic, the government had inserted itself into American life in a way that it hadn't been in decades. Do you think our response to the pandemic has even further hurt the trust society has in government?
I mean, that's the horrible thing, right? I think we're actually in a worse place than we were before the pandemic, because we're left with the CDC was I think it showed it didn't probably deserve the reputation it had. It was living on past glory.
It was revered, though. Yeah, it was certainly revered before this pandemic.
It's completely undermined its authority. I don't know. There isn't, and the society, which might have been led into a more cohesive place in response to a common threat, instead figured out a way to politicize it and tribalize it, so that people are already got their heels dug in about things like vaccines or social distancing or closing of schools, and as opposed to being open to an argument from a leader or a persuasion from a leader. So I think the answer is yes, that the credibility of the federal government on this subject is severely undermined, and it's really a shame. And there's probably a need for a rethinking of the institutions that do this. There's probably a need for, like, the Center for Disease. One of my characters, a local public health officer, before the pandemic, referred to the Centers for Disease Control as the Centers for Disease Observation and Reporting, because they didn't control disease. They didn't want to control disease. They didn't want to be anywhere near it because it was a political subject. They let the local public health people deal with the mess. And what they did was the science papers. And they do that well. We obviously need some battlefield command structure that's outside of that, and then is explained to the American people as a battlefield command structure. And you start to try to build credibility there, build authority there. Because it's not like this is not going to happen again. This isn't a one-off. We live in a world that's just ripe for this kind of problem to recur. So, and what's also terrifying is we've revealed our vulnerability to this particular threat. So it can be manufactured. I mean, it's not that hard. If the Chinese feel like, wow, this is a way to bring democracy to its knees, and we can handle it and they can't, because they can't come together in a coherent way, and they're willing to kind of just like infect each other to death. How long is it before it's used as a weapon? So there's yes, it was a gut check moment, and we're not to the place. You're right. Everybody's got pandemic fatigue. We're not to the place where anybody is ready to seem to sit back and evaluate our performance. And there are lots of things you would do. Like, you'd ask questions like, why is the death rate in the Miami area 3 times the death rate in the San Francisco area? What do they do in San Francisco? What's the difference? What can we learn from who did well and who did badly? Look at other countries, and educate the public about it.
And finally, how much is this also just about, do you think, society? I think of your upcoming series of your podcast, Against the Rules. It's about experts and our faith in experts. I also think about, and maybe I'm stretching again here, but I also think about a previous series that you did on your podcast about referees. And it really is interesting to think about how we treat referees in sports. So you even have a clip of our local basketball coach legend, Steve Kerr, who's, a son of a diplomat, really, presents himself well in public.
He's great. And he's great.
And yet he says, I talk to referees in ways I would never talk to anyone else.
That's right. It's so the simple point of that episode is a point that then you can just extrapolate from, is that it's really clear that the referees in professional basketball are so much better than they were a generation ago. And they're trained, they have feedback, they get to use technology to correct their mistakes. They're drawn from a big population rather than a small club. They're just better. They're in shape. And you can show that they're making many fewer mistakes. But people think they're worse, and people are more hostile to them. And there's a conundrum in that. Like, there's a version of this in experts. There's a whole lot of areas of expertise where the experts have gotten a lot better, and where people doubt them more. Medicine. And so what's going on there? That's the kind of thing we tease out in the podcast.
Michael Lewis has been our guest. Again, Michael Lewis is the author of the book, The Premonition, A Pandemic Story, which is out this week in paperback. And his next series, season 3 of his podcast, is called Against the Rules. Michael Lewis, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thanks so much, Mitch.